all guessed it by now, that I do have a really quick learning outcome poll. So I just kind of want to get a feel for whether or not you all are regularly assessing the student learning outcomes for your course. So I know a ton of us have course outcomes that we have likely created and are potentially measuring on a regular basis. Though I do also know that in some institutions I've worked with, they are monitoring them on more of a cycle, maybe looking at one outcome every year, and that outcome might cycle throughout the lifetime um, of the course. So I'll give you all a second to respond here. All right, it looks like the majority of you all have voted, and right now we're at 52% strongly agree and 48% agree. So that's great. You all are taking in your learning outcomes and ensuring that we are continuing to monitor them. So, in thinking about learning outcomes, we're going to do a super quick review of outcomes. Again, not going to spend a ton of time here, but do just want to make sure that we are setting that foundational level of knowledge. So, this is my favorite quote about student learning outcomes. It says, student learning is not the result of discrete experiences, but rather the product of many different kinds of experiences in and outside the classroom over an extended period of time. And I think the end of that portion is really important. Over an extended period of time. So it's not something that's going to happen overnight. It's not going to be happening within, one course instance, but certainly something that is going to persist over time. So again, just a little bit of an overview here. Outcomes assessment really helps to clarify divisional and departmental fit for a course. It really should be aligned to your institutional vision and mission, your goals, your strategic plans. I know campuses use a lot of different language, so kind of swap in whatever language you all are familiar with at San Diego Continuing Ed. It also helps to clarify to students and other constituents what a learner or a student can expect to gain and what the program is essentially going to accomplish. Outcomes assessment also provides different kinds of data and evidence about services, and it really strives to move beyond satisfaction. So we're not so worried about whether or not you like the course, but more or less what you learned during the course. And of course, we're trying to move beyond tracking. And we're really thinking more about describing how effective a course is based on the achievement of outcomes. Of course, outcomes assessment can also help us to close some of those silos that are established at some institutions between student affairs and academic affairs. Now, there is quite a difference between learning outcomes and program or operational outcomes, so I always like to highlight this part. So in here, when we have learning outcomes, we have it's very focused on the learner. It's very focused on the student or another stakeholder is to do or think as a result of a program, a course, or a service. Today's session, I know we are very highly focused around the faculty and your all interaction with formative assessment. But I do just want to point out here that um, you know, learning outcomes can be across an institution in many different spaces in programs and student affairs and our service efforts. So it's important to note that learning outcomes are happening across the institution. Now, program and operational outcomes, they really examine what a program or a process is to do to achieve or accomplish for its own improvement. And it's really usually focused around needs or satisfaction. Now, effective learning outcomes. So we all have course outcomes that are likely established for our courses that we're already teaching. Now, we might also have program outcomes, potentially, general education outcomes or institutional outcomes. But an effective learning outcome, no matter what it is really focused on the student or the learner. It focuses on learning resulting from an activity rather than the activity itself. It reflects, again, the institution's mission and values. It aligns at the course and program or academic program and department levels. It should focus mainly on skills and abilities central to the discipline. It should be general. Now, this part's hard. It should be general enough to capture important learning, but clear and specific enough to be measurable. And that piece is always a little bit tricky to have it be, general enough, but also be measurable. It should also focus on aspects of learning that will develop and endure, but that can be assessed in some form now. Now, really quickly, when we're thinking about learning outcomes, we should always be aligning to the larger institutional mission. So, and thinking about connecting to the larger picture. So we know that we might have things like institutional outcomes, department outcomes, program outcomes, and our achievement of those outcomes at our course level, which is kind of that base level of outcomes, is what is feeding and providing the data for our programs. Our course outcomes are providing the data for our departments, for our divisions, for our institution. So capturing this information and making it all connect is how we are able to tell as an institution whether or not we are fulfilling essentially what we promise to our students when they come to our institution and we say this is what we are hoping you all are going to be gaining in terms of knowledge when you graduate. But as the courses, we know that we're providing a lot of that foundational information and essentially the information that will help them to achieve those outcomes. Now, like anything else, there's challenges, right? So students don't all experience college in a way that makes outcome assessment simple, especially at San Diego Continuing Ed, knowing your population and knowing how you all are, a certificate granting institution, you have different factors that are at play here. So of course, some learning outcomes are going to take months and years, potentially even a lifetime to manifest. Um, in terms of doing a survey to measure student learning outcome data, that is likely not going to cut it because assessing learning is much more time consuming. It is much more difficult than that. And it is, quite frankly, one of the most difficult things to assess when it comes to participating in forms of assessment. It can be even difficult to identify what it is you want students to learn. Now, in thinking about structuring and creating learning outcomes, so this is something we're just going to go over again super briefly, but there's kind of three M's to outcomes. There's meaningful, so how does the outcome support the departmental mission or goal or program or course? It has to be manageable. So is the outcome realistic? This is something we come back to a lot. Is it possible that what I'm asking my students to achieve in my one course for this one term, is it realistic? Are they able to gain that knowledge? Will I be able to prove whether or not they did achieve this outcome, which is where measurement comes in, right? So how are we going to measure the student learning outcome? And how will you know if the outcome is going to be achieved? Now, this is the measurable part. This is where we're starting to think about different assessment methods, of which formative assessment is one of them. So again, kind of building that foundational level and thinking through, especially in the outcome space, how can we leverage formative assessment to begin to determine whether or not our learners are achieving the student learning outcomes that we have set forth. Now, there's of course a structure for everything. So there's a structure for the way in which you can write a learning outcome. So, audience, condition, behavior, and degree are all four components of a learning outcome. And you can see here, it's also known as the ABCD structure. I'm sure you all have heard of it. It is something that is very popular in higher education and really a way in which we look to create quality learning outcome statements. Now, to really just establish this, so the audience or the students will be able to B, learn what, C, under what circumstances or conditions, and then D, to this level of efficiency or effectiveness. Now, in thinking about writing learning outcomes, we always think about Bloom's taxonomy. So, Bloom's taxonomy is essentially a a guide that you all can use in order to determine what assessment methods should be used to identify the level of learning that has occurred. So when you're asking your students to provide you with evidence, you're going to need to be able to make a statement about the learning that had occurred. And using Bloom's taxonomy is a way to incorporate some language in order to align essentially a activity with a verb. So if we're looking here, we are thinking about, this probably looks familiar. There's all different types of charts of Bloom's taxonomy, but this one is pretty popular. So there's different levels of knowledge, different levels of Bloom's taxonomy, and we're starting the base level, remembering. So really asking students to recall relevant information. So asking them to choose something, to define something, to identify something. This is very base level. This is low level learning. Then we get to understanding. So we're asking them to classify something, to compare something, to make sense of what they've learned. Then there's applying. So again, we're going up in the chain here. So applying is all about organizing, performing, connecting. And then we have analyzing, which is distinguishing, establishing, finding, researching, really breaking the concepts into parts and understanding how each part is related or correlates to another. Then evaluating, so making judgments based on a set of guidelines, adapting, combining, proposing, extending. These are different types of things that we'd be able to incorporate into those learning outcome statements. And then finally creating, so designing, providing, validating, persuading, right? Different levels of Bloom's taxonomy is going to be appropriate for different courses and different course outcomes. Now, I'm just going to kind of wrap us up with learning outcomes today by indicating that I'll be sending you all a resource on a learning outcome worksheet that will help you all in potentially either analyzing the current learning outcomes that you all have created, or even potentially helping you to create some new ones. Now, when we're thinking about assessing learning outcomes, specifically, of course, program outcomes too, but we're really focused on learning today. We first want to determine your outcomes, and based on the poll information that you all have already provided, most of you or all of you replied that you are regularly assessing your outcomes, which means you have outcomes. So you have already done step one. Congratulations to all of you. You've already determined your outcomes, and the next step is really going to be to determine your methods. So methods are going to bring us directly into formative assessment. Before it does, though, I do want to talk quickly about what type of data you're going to need. So we're either going to need quantitative data or we're going to need qualitative data, or it may not really matter for us what type of data we need. We may just need feedback in the moment. So let's think about this. Qualitative data, is something that can be expressed as a number, or it can be quantified. It's really easy to report and analyze. It is pretty easy to construct. It doesn't involve as much time. Quantitative is where we're looking for more of text or narrative from respondents. It definitely has a lot more depth to it. It is much more robust. So think about how much time you have when you're thinking about formative assessment as we get into that session, because knowing what type of data you need might be really closely tied to the amount of time that you have. So that's kind of why I wanted to highlight the qualitative and the quantitative, because we are going to need to think about that. And I'm actually noticing now that I have my titles of these two columns reversed. So I'll adjust that before I send you all the PDF of these. But quantitative should be on our left-hand side and qualitative should be over our right. So I apologize for that.